Have you ever watched someone mistake a neighborhood rulebook for absolute authority? That question was still echoing in my mind as I stood behind a line of yellow school buses stretching nearly a quarter-mile down the narrow entrance road, every engine idling, every driver waiting for an answer that should have taken seconds instead of becoming the longest hour of the day. The flashing warning lights reflected off polished SUVs parked along the curb, while anxious parents gathered near the sidewalks trying to understand why the convoy had stopped less than 300 feet from the school entrance. In the middle of it all stood Victoria Langford, the president of the Homeowners Association, dressed in an expensive designer outfit covered in bold colors, oversized jewelry catching the afternoon sun, her confident posture making it clear she believed the entire street answered to her. She folded her arms and calmly informed everyone that no bus would enter the neighborhood until her board approved an exception to the community traffic policy. The silence that followed felt almost impossible to believe. The drivers exchanged confused glances. School staff looked toward one another, hoping someone had misunderstood what had just been said. But Victoria never flinched. She repeated herself with complete confidence, insisting that HOA regulations existed for a reason and that emergency planning should have respected community procedures. I stepped out of my county emergency response vehicle, clipped my identification badge back onto my shirt after the wind had turned it sideways, and walked toward the growing crowd. My name is Mason Brooks, and after nearly 15 years coordinating emergency logistics across 3 counties, I had learned one lesson that never changed. In a crisis, confusion spreads faster than facts. That afternoon wasn't about panic. It wasn't about dramatic shouting or reckless decisions. It was about minutes. Every unnecessary delay multiplied into another problem waiting to happen somewhere else. The school administration had already activated its emergency relocation plan. Local transportation officials had coordinated available buses, and every driver had followed the designated route provided only 40 minutes earlier. On paper, everything had been organized exactly the way it should have been. Yet here we were, stopped by a portable gate that had been rolled across a private access lane and surrounded by volunteers wearing bright HOA badges instead of emergency credentials. Parents began asking questions all at once. Was the school closing? Was there danger nearby? Why weren't the buses moving? I could hear dozens of conversations blending together, each one filling the air with more uncertainty than the last. The children waiting near the front entrance looked more curious than frightened, but they were watching every adult carefully, searching for clues about how serious the situation really was. That alone reminded me how important calm leadership could be. Victoria raised one hand to quiet the crowd and spoke with practiced confidence, explaining that neighborhood standards protected property values and resident safety, and that allowing a fleet of buses through the community without HOA authorization would set an unacceptable precedent. Her words sounded polished, almost rehearsed, and several residents standing behind her nodded in agreement, though others looked increasingly uncomfortable as the minutes continued to slip away. I introduced myself, thanked her for speaking with me, and politely asked if we could step aside to review the transportation authorization together. She smiled without warmth and informed me that her decision had already been made. According to her interpretation of the neighborhood bylaws, no outside fleet could enter until the HOA completed its own review process. I looked beyond her toward the line of buses, each one representing careful planning, dedicated drivers, and families expecting the adults in charge to solve problems instead of creating new ones. The afternoon sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the pavement, while radios crackled inside several emergency vehicles waiting farther down the road. At that moment, I realized this wasn't simply a disagreement about traffic. It was becoming a test of whether common sense could prevail before valuable time disappeared completely, and I had the unmistakable feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger story. I kept my voice steady because experience had taught me that matching confidence with confidence rarely solved anything. "Ms. Langford," I said, "my only priority right now is making sure everyone gets where they need to go safely and efficiently." She answered with a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "And my priority is protecting this community," she replied. Around us, conversations continued to grow louder as parents looked from the buses to the temporary gate and back again, searching for someone who could finally provide a clear answer. I understood why they were frustrated. From their perspective, Every adult standing near that entrance represented authority, yet none of us appeared to agree. I asked one of the transportation supervisors to quietly confirm that every bus was ready to depart the moment access became available. He nodded and assured me the drivers were prepared. That was one less variable to worry about. The next step was understanding exactly why this disagreement had reached the point where an entire transportation plan had stalled. Victoria produced a neatly organized binder filled with community guidelines. She turned several pages before stopping at a section describing traffic restrictions for oversized commercial vehicles. She spoke carefully, emphasizing every sentence as though the document itself settled the issue beyond discussion. I listened without interrupting because people were far more willing to reveal their thinking when they believed they had been fully heard. When she finished, I thanked her for showing me the policy and explained that emergency coordination followed a different process established by the agencies responsible for public operations. She immediately responded that no one had contacted the association in advance and that residents deserved notice before dozens of buses entered the neighborhood. I could appreciate why communication mattered. In fact, good communication prevented many problems before they started. But I also knew that unexpected situations sometimes required plans to change faster than anyone preferred. Looking past the entrance, I noticed several teachers keeping students engaged with quiet conversations and simple activities so the waiting felt less stressful. Their calm professionalism reminded me that leadership often happened without anyone noticing. Nearby, one bus driver stepped outside for a moment, stretched his legs, and exchanged a reassuring smile with a worried parent. No one wanted an argument. Everyone wanted movement. That difference mattered. I radioed our coordination center and requested an updated status report on alternate routes, knowing there might be another option if this delay continued. The answer came back a minute later. Every alternate entrance would significantly increase travel time because of ongoing road work and afternoon traffic. That meant resolving the situation here remained the most practical solution. I thanked the dispatcher and clipped the radio back onto my belt. Victoria watched the exchange with obvious curiosity, but remained unmoved. She believed procedure supported her position, and nothing I had said had changed that belief. Instead of pushing harder, I shifted the conversation. I asked her what outcome she hoped to achieve by keeping the entrance closed. For the first time, she paused before answering. She spoke about preserving order, protecting neighborhood standards, and making sure the association was respected whenever outside organizations operated within the community. Hearing those concerns helped me understand that this had become about recognition as much as regulations. While we spoke, more residents quietly gathered nearby. Some agreed with her. Others whispered that the buses should simply be allowed through. The crowd itself had become divided, and that uncertainty spread almost as quickly as the original delay. Standing there, I realized the next decision would shape everything that followed, because once more people became involved, finding common ground would become even more difficult than it already was. The atmosphere shifted in subtle ways that only became obvious after years of working through difficult situations. Nobody was raising their voice anymore. Instead, everyone was waiting to see who would make the next move, and that kind of silence carried its own weight. I glanced at my watch, then toward the row of buses where every driver remained exactly where they had been instructed to stay. Their professionalism impressed me. They knew that becoming impatient would only make the situation harder to resolve. A school administrator approached me with a clipboard held tightly against her chest and quietly asked whether she should begin contacting parents again. I answered honestly, "Give me a few more minutes. I believe we can still solve this without creating even more confusion." She nodded, although I could tell she was running through every possible backup plan in her mind. Victoria Langford appeared completely comfortable with the delay. She greeted several residents by name as though this were an ordinary afternoon community meeting instead of an unexpected disruption. Her confidence came from certainty. She genuinely believed that because the entrance road crossed association property before reaching the school access point, the association had complete authority over what happened there. That conviction explained why she never hesitated. From her perspective, she was simply enforcing rules that everyone else had ignored. I respected the fact that she cared deeply about her neighborhood, but I also recognized that focusing on a single set of rules without considering the larger situation often created unnecessary obstacles. I stepped a few feet away and called the county coordination office once more. This time I asked them to verify every agency involved in the transportation plan, not because I doubted the preparation, but because accurate information often became the strongest tool during disagreements. Within moments, I received confirmation that the buses had been assigned according to the approved relocation procedure and that communication with local officials had occurred before the convoy departed. I thanked the coordinator and requested electronic copies of the authorization documents. Technology had changed emergency response dramatically over the years. What once required stacks of paperwork could now arrive on a secure tablet in less than a minute. As I waited for the files to download, I noticed several parents beginning to encourage one another instead of expressing frustration. One family passed bottled water to another. A teacher organized a simple counting game for younger students standing near the sidewalk. Those small acts reminded me that communities became stronger when ordinary people chose cooperation over conflict. The documents appeared on my screen one after another. I reviewed each page carefully before walking back toward Victoria. I did not intend to overwhelm her with legal language. My goal was much simpler. I wanted both of us to work from the same facts. I handed her the tablet and invited her to read the transportation authorization herself. She accepted it with visible skepticism, scrolling through every page without speaking. For several long moments, neither of us said anything. Residents watched from a respectful distance, curious whether the paperwork would finally settle the disagreement. When Victoria finished reading, she returned the tablet without changing her expression. She acknowledged that the transportation plan had official approval, yet insisted that her association had never agreed to temporary access through the neighborhood entrance. The discussion had moved forward, but only slightly. We were no longer debating whether planning existed. We were debating how different responsibilities fit together during an unusual situation. I realized then that simply presenting more documents would not change her mind. She needed reassurance that listening did not mean surrendering her principles, while everyone else needed confidence that practical solutions were still possible. As the afternoon continued and the waiting stretched longer than anyone had expected, another vehicle slowly entered the parking area nearby, drawing the attention of every person gathered at the entrance. Whoever had just arrived carried the possibility of changing the entire conversation, although none of us yet knew exactly how. The vehicle that rolled into the parking area belonged to Daniel Harper, the county transportation director, a man whose reputation had been built on solving complicated logistical problems without turning them into personal conflicts. He stepped out carrying nothing more than a tablet and a folder, offering a friendly greeting to everyone within earshot before walking directly toward us. His calm demeanor immediately lowered the tension, not because he carried extraordinary authority, but because people recognized someone who was willing to listen before speaking. Daniel shook my hand, nodded politely to Victoria Langford, and asked if each of us could explain the situation from our own perspective. Victoria spoke first. She carefully outlined the association traffic policy, emphasizing that residents expected consistency whenever community rules were involved. She explained that exceptions, even well-intentioned ones, often became examples that people cited months later. Daniel listened without interrupting, occasionally asking short questions to clarify timelines and responsibilities. When she finished, he thanked her for presenting her concerns in an organized manner. Then he turned toward me. I explained how the transportation plan had been assembled earlier that day, how school officials and county coordinators had selected the safest available route, and how every bus remained ready to move as soon as access became available. I showed him the authorization documents that had already been reviewed. He examined them carefully before quietly confirming that the planning process had followed the established emergency transportation procedures. Rather than declaring a winner in the discussion, Daniel suggested that we focus on a practical solution instead of debating who had made the first mistake. His approach changed the atmosphere almost immediately. Residents who had been whispering among themselves stepped a little closer, hoping that the conversation would finally produce progress. Parents stopped checking their phones every few seconds and began paying attention to what was being said. Even several bus drivers leaned slightly out of their windows, watching with cautious optimism. Daniel asked Victoria a simple question. If we can document today's circumstances as a unique situation and confirm that it does not automatically change future neighborhood policies, Would you be willing to reconsider your position? She hesitated longer than she had at any point during the afternoon. It was the first sign that she was genuinely thinking rather than immediately rejecting the proposal. She looked toward the entrance road, then toward the waiting buses, and finally back at the residents standing nearby. Some quietly encouraged flexibility while others remained silent, allowing her to make the decision without public pressure. Before she answered, one of the teachers approached with a respectful request. She explained that the students had remained remarkably patient, but that the longer everyone waited, the more difficult it would become to keep them focused and comfortable. Her words contained no criticism, only an honest description of the situation. That quiet observation carried more weight than any argument either side had presented. Victoria slowly adjusted the colorful scarf draped over her designer jacket and released a measured breath. She admitted that she still believed the association should have received earlier communication, but she also acknowledged that the circumstances were clearly different from ordinary neighborhood traffic. Daniel thanked her for recognizing that distinction and proposed drafting a follow-up meeting after the situation ended so everyone could review communication procedures together. It was not a perfect resolution, but it gave every side a chance to protect what mattered most. As I looked toward the line of buses, I noticed drivers sitting a little straighter, sensing that movement might finally be close. Yet before anyone celebrated, Daniel received a call on his phone, listened carefully for several seconds, and his thoughtful expression suggested that new information had just arrived, information that could change every assumption we had made since the afternoon began. Daniel lowered his phone slowly, taking a moment before speaking, and that brief pause captured everyone's attention more effectively than any raised voice ever could. He explained that the school district had updated its transportation timeline because another campus in the county was now preparing for the same coordinated relocation plan later that afternoon. The delay at our location was beginning to affect resources scheduled for other schools, creating a chain reaction that no one had anticipated when the first buses arrived. The news changed the conversation immediately. This was no longer about one entrance or one neighborhood. Every additional minute meant drivers, dispatchers, and school staff across the county would need to revise carefully coordinated schedules. I could see several residents exchanging concerned looks as they realized the situation had grown beyond the boundaries of their own community. Victoria remained composed, but her confident expression softened ever so slightly. She asked Daniel whether another entrance could still be used. He answered honestly that while alternate routes technically existed, each option would add significant travel time and require reorganizing dozens of vehicles already committed to the transportation plan. None of those alternatives represented the safest or most efficient choice. He emphasized that everyone standing there shared the same objective, protecting students through an orderly process while minimizing unnecessary disruption. Hearing the issue framed that way seemed to resonate with several people gathered nearby. A retired teacher quietly remarked that cooperation often accomplished more than strict interpretation during unusual circumstances. Another resident nodded in agreement, adding that extraordinary situations sometimes required practical judgment rather than perfect procedures. Their comments were respectful rather than confrontational, and that respectful tone prevented the discussion from becoming personal. Victoria listened carefully without interrupting. For the first time since I had arrived, she looked beyond the temporary gate and studied the line of buses instead of the policy binder tucked beneath her arm. Children continued waiting patiently with their teachers, some reading books while others chatted quietly with friends. Parents stood together sharing updates, doing their best to keep everyone calm despite the uncertainty. The entire scene reflected remarkable patience, but patience was not unlimited. Every person there deserved a clear path forward. Daniel suggested documenting the day's events in writing so the Homeowners Association, school district, and county transportation office could review communication procedures together after operations concluded. He explained that future planning could always improve, but improvements could only happen after the immediate needs of the day had been addressed. I appreciated the way he balanced accountability with practicality. No one was being dismissed, yet no one was losing sight of the people waiting behind us. Victoria adjusted the bracelet on her wrist and slowly closed the binder she had carried throughout the afternoon. Instead of answering immediately, she asked one final question. She wanted assurance that today's decision would not automatically become a standing policy for future traffic requests. Daniel assured her that each situation would continue to be evaluated individually and that today's discussion would be fully documented for future reference. The explanation appeared to ease one of her greatest concerns. Around us, conversations grew noticeably quieter as everyone sensed the moment of decision had finally arrived. I glanced toward the transportation supervisors, who had already begun preparing their radios in anticipation of movement. The drivers remained seated with engines ready, demonstrating the same professionalism they had shown since the beginning of the delay. Just as Victoria drew a breath to respond, another notification sounded from Daniel's phone. He reviewed the message, looked toward me, and said that senior county administrators had completed their review of the transportation plan and were prepared to provide formal guidance within minutes. Whatever happened next would not only determine whether the buses could finally move, but also establish a clear framework that everyone involved could rely upon for the remainder of the operation. Within less than 5 minutes, the guidance Daniel had been waiting for arrived through the county coordination system. He reviewed the message carefully before turning the tablet so both Victoria and I could read the summary together. The instructions were straightforward. The transportation operation would continue under the existing county emergency coordination plan, while all questions regarding neighborhood communication and future procedures would be documented for review after the relocation had been completed. No one standing at the entrance was being asked to abandon their concerns. Instead, the guidance recognized that the immediate priority was completing the transportation plan in the safest and most orderly way possible, then evaluating what could be improved afterward. I appreciated the balance of that decision because it respected both public coordination and community involvement without treating either as unimportant. Daniel looked at Victoria with the same calm expression he had maintained all afternoon. He thanked her for remaining engaged in the discussion and explained that the county would gladly schedule a meeting with the Homeowners Association once operations concluded. He also assured her that the association would have an opportunity to share recommendations for future communication so similar misunderstandings could be avoided. For the first time since the buses had arrived, Victoria did not immediately answer. She glanced toward the residents gathered behind her. Several of them offered encouraging smiles, while others simply waited quietly. The atmosphere had changed completely from confrontation to expectation. Everyone seemed to understand that the next decision would affect far more than the people standing at the entrance. It would determine whether an entire transportation schedule could finally move forward. Victoria slowly opened the binder one last time, looked down at the highlighted pages she had referenced throughout the afternoon, then closed it again without saying a word. She adjusted the colorful jacket draped neatly over her shoulders and took a measured breath before speaking. She acknowledged that the association's concerns about communication remained important, but she also recognized that continuing the delay would no longer serve the broader interests of the community. Hearing those words felt like watching months of tension disappear in only a few seconds. Daniel thanked her sincerely rather than triumphantly. There was no celebration, no dramatic announcement, only quiet appreciation that practical cooperation had finally replaced disagreement. Victoria turned toward 2 volunteers standing beside the temporary gate and instructed them to clear the entrance. They immediately began rolling the portable barrier toward the sidewalk, creating a wide path for the waiting buses. The movement drew the attention of everyone nearby. Parents who had been watching anxiously exchanged relieved smiles. Teachers gently gathered students closer together, preparing them to board in an organized manner. Several bus drivers gave subtle waves through their windshields after seeing the path open in front of them. I radioed the transportation supervisor and confirmed that access had been restored. His response came back almost instantly. Every driver was ready. I watched as the first bus eased forward at a slow, careful pace, following the planned route exactly as originally intended. There was no rush because there no longer needed to be one. Order had replaced uncertainty. As each vehicle passed through the entrance, residents standing nearby stepped back respectfully, some even offering friendly waves to the children looking out the windows. The tension that had dominated the afternoon gradually gave way to quiet relief. Victoria remained near the sidewalk, observing the procession with folded hands. Although she looked thoughtful, She also appeared relieved that the situation was finally moving toward a constructive conclusion. Daniel quietly reminded me that the work was not finished simply because the buses were moving. After every operation, successful or difficult, the real lessons emerged during the review process. He was right. Solving the immediate problem mattered, but understanding how to prevent the next one mattered just as much. As the final buses approached the entrance and the operation settled into a smooth rhythm, I realized that the afternoon would leave everyone involved with a different perspective on communication, responsibility, and the value of listening before assuming the worst. As the last of the buses disappeared beyond the curve in the road, the atmosphere changed in a way that no one could have predicted only an hour earlier. The conversations that had once been filled with uncertainty became quiet exchanges of relief, and the people who had been standing on opposite sides of the discussion slowly drifted back together as neighbors instead of opponents. I remained near the entrance with Daniel while transportation supervisors confirmed that every vehicle had reached its next checkpoint on schedule. Each radio update carried a little more confidence than the last, reinforcing that the operation was finally moving exactly as intended. Victoria stood several yards away watching volunteers fold the temporary barricade and return traffic cones to the storage trailer. She no longer carried the same commanding posture that had defined the beginning of the afternoon. Instead, she appeared thoughtful, almost reflective, as though replaying every conversation in her mind. After a few moments, she walked toward us without the binder tucked beneath her arm for the first time that day. She thanked Daniel for taking the time to explain the broader transportation picture instead of dismissing her concerns. Then she turned to me and admitted that she had been so focused on protecting neighborhood procedures that she had failed to recognize how many different organizations had already coordinated the larger plan. I appreciated her honesty because acknowledging a misunderstanding often required more confidence than insisting on being right. I told her that emergency coordination depended on partnerships just as much as procedures, and that every agency, neighborhood, and community organization benefited when communication happened early and often. She agreed that future conversations should begin long before unusual situations reached the entrance of a neighborhood. Several residents who had remained nearby joined the discussion, offering constructive suggestions about creating a shared contact list, organizing annual planning meetings, and inviting community leaders to observe transportation exercises so they would better understand how large operations were coordinated. None of the ideas focused on assigning blame. Instead, everyone seemed interested in preventing similar misunderstandings from developing again. Daniel smiled as he recorded notes on his tablet, explaining that some of the strongest improvements to public planning came directly from conversations like this one. The teachers who had stayed behind while the final students departed thanked the volunteers for helping restore order around the entrance. Parents who had witnessed the entire afternoon expressed appreciation to everyone involved, recognizing that although the delay had been frustrating, the willingness to keep talking rather than arguing had ultimately produced a better outcome. Watching those conversations unfold reminded me why I had stayed in emergency coordination for so many years. Success was rarely measured by dramatic moments. More often it was measured by ordinary people choosing cooperation over conflict when the easier choice would have been stubbornness. Before leaving, Victoria asked whether she could attend the county review meeting that Daniel had proposed. He welcomed the idea immediately, explaining that future planning worked best when every perspective was represented. As we packed away radios, paperwork, and temporary equipment, the entrance looked exactly as it had earlier that morning, but the people standing there were not quite the same. Everyone carried a better understanding of how easily assumptions could create obstacles and how quickly those obstacles could disappear when people became willing to listen. Driving away, I glanced once more in the rearview mirror and saw neighbors helping one another clear the remaining equipment from the roadside, proving that the most important change of the day had not been the reopening of an entrance, but the rebuilding of trust that would make the next challenge easier for everyone involved. The following week felt remarkably different from the afternoon that had brought everyone together under unexpected circumstances. Instead of hurried conversations beside idling buses, representatives from the neighborhood, school administration, transportation planners, and community volunteers gathered around a long conference table with notebooks, calendars, and a shared determination to learn from what had happened. I arrived a few minutes early and noticed Victoria already seated with a neatly organized folder replacing the thick binder she had carried before. Her colorful style had not changed, but her approach certainly had. Rather than positioning herself across the room, she chose a seat beside several school administrators and greeted each person as they arrived. That simple decision quietly set the tone for the meeting before it officially began. Daniel opened the discussion by thanking everyone for attending and explained that the purpose was not to revisit disagreements, but to improve future coordination. He reminded the group that every successful operation depended on preparation long before an unexpected situation ever developed. One by one, participants described what they had experienced from their own perspectives. Bus drivers explained how clear communication helped them remain calm even during long delays. Teachers spoke about keeping students reassured by projecting confidence instead of uncertainty. Parents shared how receiving timely updates made it easier to remain patient while plans evolved. Each viewpoint added another piece to the larger picture, revealing that everyone had been trying to protect the same community even though they had approached the situation differently. When it was Victoria's turn to speak, the room became noticeably quieter. She acknowledged that she had focused almost entirely on neighborhood procedures without fully understanding how many moving parts were involved in the larger transportation plan. She explained that protecting residents had always been her motivation, but she now recognized that effective protection also required collaboration with organizations beyond the neighborhood itself. Her comments were thoughtful rather than defensive, and several people around the table nodded in appreciation. I spoke after her and emphasized that emergency planning rarely succeeded because of one individual. It succeeded because dozens of people trusted one another enough to share information, ask questions, and adjust when circumstances changed. Daniel then presented several practical recommendations developed from everyone's feedback. A direct communication list would connect neighborhood representatives with transportation coordinators before any large operation. Annual planning sessions would allow community leaders to ask questions well in advance instead of during active situations. Simple reference guides explaining transportation procedures would be distributed to participating organizations so expectations remained consistent across every group involved. None of the recommendations required expensive equipment or complicated technology. They required something much more valuable: consistent communication and mutual respect. As the meeting continued, the atmosphere became increasingly collaborative. Ideas that might once have sounded like criticism were now welcomed as opportunities for improvement. Even moments of disagreement felt constructive because everyone had committed to solving future problems instead of defending past decisions. Before the meeting concluded, Daniel summarized the progress that had been made. He reminded everyone that communities became stronger not because they avoided difficult situations, but because they learned from them together. Looking around the room, I realized the greatest success had not been the transportation plan itself. It had been the willingness of people with different responsibilities to sit together afterward, listen carefully, and leave with a better understanding of one another. Walking toward the parking lot, Victoria caught up with me and thanked me for remaining patient throughout the entire experience. I smiled and told her that patience worked best when both sides eventually chose to listen. She laughed softly, agreeing that sometimes the most important lesson arrived only after everyone stopped trying to win and started trying to understand. And as we headed toward our separate vehicles, it was clear that the relationships built after the challenge would prove far more valuable than the disagreement that had first brought everyone together. Months later, I found myself driving through the same neighborhood on an ordinary afternoon, and it was almost impossible to believe how different everything felt. Children rode their bicycles along the sidewalks, neighbors chatted while walking their dogs, and the entrance that had once become the center of so much uncertainty now looked like any other peaceful community road. If someone had driven past that day without knowing the history, they never would have guessed that one unexpected afternoon had inspired so many positive changes. Daniel had kept his promise. The planning meetings became a regular part of the county calendar, bringing together transportation coordinators, school administrators, neighborhood representatives, and volunteers before challenges ever had a chance to develop. Instead of waiting for confusion to create conflict, people now introduced themselves, exchanged contact information, and discussed possible scenarios long before they needed to respond to one. That simple change transformed the way everyone worked together. Victoria attended every meeting. The confidence that had once been directed almost entirely toward enforcing neighborhood procedures gradually evolved into something far more valuable. She became one of the strongest advocates for early communication, often reminding new association board members that understanding the complete picture mattered just as much as understanding local policies. She still cared deeply about protecting her community, but she had discovered that cooperation often protected it far better than confrontation ever could. Watching that change unfold reminded me that leadership was not measured by never making mistakes. It was measured by having the courage to learn from them. Every person involved carried away a lesson that extended far beyond a single afternoon. The teachers demonstrated remarkable patience under pressure. The transportation teams proved that professionalism did not disappear simply because plans changed. Parents showed that calm encouragement could steady an entire community. Residents learned that asking thoughtful questions often produced better answers than making quick assumptions. Even I walked away with a renewed appreciation that listening carefully before responding could prevent small disagreements from becoming much larger obstacles. Looking back now, I rarely think about the delay itself. Instead, I remember the conversations that happened afterward, because those conversations created improvements that continued benefiting people long after the buses had reached their destination. That is the remarkable thing about communities. They are strengthened not by avoiding every challenge, but by choosing to grow after facing one together. Every difficult moment presents two possible paths. One path leads toward blame, frustration, and division. The other leads toward understanding, cooperation, and better preparation for whatever comes next. Thankfully, everyone involved eventually chose the second path. As I drove away that afternoon, I realized the real success had never been about opening a road or completing a transportation schedule. It had been about restoring trust between people who all believed they were acting in the best interests of others. Trust takes time to build, patience to maintain, and humility to repair, but once it returns, it becomes stronger than any temporary disagreement. That lesson has stayed with me ever since. Now I would love to hear your thoughts. If you had been standing there that afternoon, how do you think you would have handled the situation, and what lesson stood out to you the most from this story? Share your perspective in the comments, because every thoughtful opinion adds something valuable to the conversation. And if you enjoy character-driven stories about leadership, community, and finding common ground through difficult situations, consider subscribing so you will not miss future stories that explore the choices people make when character matters most.